You may take your seat. Master of Arts in International Security and Terrorism, Aheli Moitra has applied to defend her thesis, The Morong Express, Naganes, Indigeneity and Religion, for the degree of Philosophia Doctor. As part of the examination for this degree, Aheli Moitra will now give a trial lecture on the assigned topic, the benefits and challenges of conducting research as an insider. I hereby give the floor to the doctoral candidate.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. I will try not to rush. Good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you're attending this lecture from. The topic I have been asked to think through today is benefits and challenges of conducting research as an insider. Those of us here who have been involved in social sciences and humanities research, particularly researching human but distant others on distant lands, will immediately resonate with the topic. The history of these fields of research from roughly the 16th and particularly the 18th to 20th centuries were informed by colonizing missions that regarded the world as their oyster. To discover, scientifically examine, build theories of knowledge around, and ultimately civilize. To counter the free-for-all attitudes inherent in that epoch, the academic response over the past 50 years has been to institutionalize a self-critical reflections paradigm. Typically, a researcher is required to reflect on structures that grant them access to study and examine the lives of the so-called other, the privilege of a view from elsewhere. Today, this other may well be a researcher from the post-colony. I'm sorry, why is that happening? Today, this researcher may be from the post-colony. Their struggles may be related to the many hierarchical structures in these post-colonies. This gives rise to the complex conundrum of the insider in the humanities and social sciences research. Growing up as a secular, modernist, globally mobile citizen of the world with an alleged view from nowhere and everywhere all at once, I always saw myself as a perennial outsider. As a former journalist, I was an objective scrutinizer of facts. It was, therefore, with considerable confusion that I pondered what it meant to be an insider. What benefits and challenges could this position bring to research? This lecture will start from an abstraction of benefits and challenges for the researcher as insider. It will then take a brief theoretical stock of insider and outsider doctrines and how they play out in the world beyond the university. It will then bring the discussion back to my own field of indigeneity and religion, presenting some methodological experiments that showcase how social sciences research have pushed boundaries of researcher as insiders or outsiders. Using my own PhD as an example, I will address what potential gains or vantage points bring to conducting research. To think through the lecture title, I began with simply answering the question, I drew out an abstract list of benefits and challenges of conducting research as an insider. There could potentially be a number of points that would fit well into each of these two sections. I will begin with the benefits. While conducting research, an insider is understood to have an a priori understanding of the context, that they know much more about the field before entering it than others. They could have and be part of established networks. They could gain methodological depth since they presumably understand the locality better. They could have access to more potential research subjects. They may hold a certain level of local credibility. They could be more familiar with cultural mores. They may have a greater extent of safety awareness. They may know what subjects to avoid with their knowledge of fissures and points of conflicts. What challenges could there be? An insider's knowledge of the field could be highly subjective based on their location within the group or the collective they are studying. They could potentially face automatic negation by the research community for being too close to the research subject or not being able to establish critical distance from them. They may hold taken for granted notions about concepts under study. Knowing something too well could lead to a difficult filtering criteria for choosing research participants. They may accept hierarchies as natural and may not be able to ask pressing questions nor push participants further to probe an issue. They may be hesitant to use categories as analytical constructs, preferring to present the data as is. This looked like a fairly decent and broad list to me. Then I decided to replace the term insider in the title with the term outsider, just to test out if it had any bearing on the list, to what extent or how. So, does the outsider have some a priori understanding of context before entering for research? Definitely. Why else would they be conducting a high level of scientific inquiry into the matter? Do they try to establish some contact and establish a network before going into the field? Yes, many researchers make contact with local newspapers, universities, acquaintances, activists, and others before taking the plunge into fieldwork. Outsiders could potentially have developed a range of methodological approaches at the universities they were trained in. They could have access to elite contacts or alternatively uncanny research subjects based on their points of entry. They could have read online and ancient literature on the right ways to behave in a cultural context. They could similarly develop a heightened degree of safety and follow measures like registering with a local police station before shuttling off to an unknown terrain. They could have read varied newspaper reports on conflicts in the region and have a better understanding of the same. Similarly, let us look at the challenges. What stops an outsider from having a subjective understanding of the field and its issues? Much human observation on the matter of humanities has already been established to be subjective. On the second challenge, some change occurs. The outsider may rarely face automatic negation from the academic community, instead getting some sort of automatic objectivity accorded to them. They may have brought with themselves a load of taken for granted notions from the university or parts of the world they hail from, on the other hand. Outsiders may find it difficult to choose research participants if they know very few people or are barred access for technical and other reasons. Outsiders may also take hierarchies as natural when they are unable to identify them. For instance, Outsiders may feel guilty about being unfairly analytical about people's lives and issues that have struggled to be freed from such top-down baggage throughout history. If this kind of switching around was that simple, I wondered what presumptions I had made about these categories that led to a list like this. To grasp over and think over this conundrum, I turn to the discipline in which I have been trained and become an insider to in the past 4 years, that is, religious studies. The key approach in this discipline entails an examination of, on the one hand, knowledge and truth claims and practices that are classified as sacred, religious, essential, with a clearly demarcated inside. On the other hand, are knowledge claims and practices that are classified as profane, secular, mundane, and on the outside. These claims could be made either by insiders or outsiders to a practice or knowledge system, or about things in the world. Religious studies focuses on how these two so separated domains relate to one another in daily life, discourse, practices, and so on. Which actors continue to draw upon such distinctions or relate them, and with what purposes and effects? The notion of inside and outsider in social science research has been considered at length, gaining momentum in the past 50 years. The sociologist Robert K. Merton was an important OG figure in the exploration of the distinction between the inside and outsider as a researcher. While his paper titled Insiders and Outsiders, a chapter in the Sociology of Knowledge, is worth exploring in its entirety, I will draw from Merton the doctrinal presumptions that underlie the categories. On the one hand, are insiders, who are supposed to be members of specified groups or collectives or occupants of specified social statuses. The major presumption for this category is that one must be one to understand one. On the other hand is the outsider, who is simply a non-member. The major presumption underlying this category is that no matter how careful and talented, the outsider is excluded in principle from gaining access to the social cultural truth. The myth inherent here is that the judgment of insiders is best trusted when they assess groups other than their own. Of course, as Merton points out in one of his many critiques challenging the presumed distinction, is that individuals do not have a single status, but a status set. People can be transgender, Norwegian, age 50 to 60, on the left of politics, have physical or developmental disabilities, and be relatively poor all at once, or two or one set at a time. To which status set one is considered is insided to or outsided from depends on time, space, and event-specific constraints. Audre Lorde reiterated this notion during a speech made at Harvard University in February 1982 in the context of political struggle. There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. Lorde said this while speaking as Black, feminist, lesbian, American, inheritor in the tradition of Malcolm X. And though nuanced thinking is possible, these categories have been put to effective use, particularly beyond the confines of the university. In India itself, the question of insiders and outsiders is often taken to a crescendo. Right-wing trolls, including several Bollywood actors like Kangana Ranaut, whose tweet you see in this picture, attacked the artist Rihanna for supporting the farmers' protest that ensued several months in 2021. To Rihanna's tweet on why aren't we talking about this hashtag farmers protest, that several others, including climate activist Greta Thunberg, tweeted, Renaud tweeted back with, I quote, "No one is talking about it because they are not farmers. They are terrorists who are trying to divide India so that China can take over our vulnerable, broken nation and make it a Chinese colony much like USA. Sit down, you fool, we are selling our nation. We are not selling our nation like you dummies." More than 48,000 people loved the tweet. With the Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP taking over and maintaining political power in India since 2014, it has become commonplace for people affiliated with their notion of so-called Hindu and indigenous resurgence to condemn and abuse detractors of current government policies. Whether Indian citizens or not, such detractors are outsided by terming them terrorists and denying them their labor entitlements. On the other hand, outsider protesters of government policy are termed fools and dummies, sometimes blaming China for provoking discontent and at times demanding that all shades of detractors be sent to Pakistan, the clearly demarcated and villainous other to New India or Bharat. But painting a special, sacred inner core is also common in two fields of study that I am an academic researcher in: indigeneity and religion. I derived these two images from a Google search for indigenous methodologies and religion. The first showed various ways to center what is at the core of indigenous value systems and what happens when you start getting away from such a core in a variety of ways. These are decidedly different from the example of exclusionary inside versus outside claims cited before. Here, long marginalized and oppressed minorities attempt to center their being. In no small part are these reminiscent of world religious systems or religious world systems that strictly demarcate an inner core of religion by defining and exacting loyalty from the insider who is in relation with the outsider in very specifically demarcated ways. This is not to suggest that indigeneity and religion are the same. Indigenous methodologies emerged as responses to historical and colonial research methods that did not see indigenous people as human at all, decentering them from and denying them human species being. Religion was very much a part of that decentering enterprise. But today, these two fields, with fairly strict inside and outsider norms, find themselves connected. How has academic research responded to these networks, affiliations, and relations? Excuse me. I will cite a few examples of research produced by the Religious Studies Department at UIT to show how researchers relate to these strict insider versus outsider regimes in this field. How did they methodologically traverse their own position as insider, outsider, and in-betweens? The first is an example of the research project and eventual book on indigenous religions, local grounds, global networks. One of the methods the researchers used to further examine the relations between indigeneity and religion was to visit each other's field sites. So, a group of researchers under the comparative umbrella of indigenous religion went from Sapme to Nagaland to Talamanca to Hawaii to Gujarat, noting the differences and similarities that they saw in each other's fields that they had studied till then as part of their own individual fieldwork. The co-produced research project should be read entirely for breaking barriers to categorical norms and collective research. Their most important contribution for me was shining analytical light on indigeneity and religion, how they're articulated to and translated towards or away from each other, but also when combined as indigenous religion, serve as tools, methods, frames for historicizing and building politics in the world today. Their approach became the springboard for several other research studies. One among them, and my second example, is Lyudmila Nikanorova's PhD dissertation on religion and indigeneity at EHEC in the Sakha Republic in Russia. In a definitional sense, as laid out before, Nikanorova may be considered an insider who is a member of the Sakha community that she is familiar with. She grew up with the practices she wrote about. Reflections on her past and present experiences at EHEC, an annual celebration, added much to her ethnography and our understanding of the terrain that insiders as researchers inhabit. Her methodological approach to studying how indigeneity and religion were articulated at contemporary EHEC came with an added level of analysis as she worked also as an academic insider. In a way, she compared local and insider articulations with scholarly and outsider articulations of similar concepts, becoming an important research contribution to the field, suggesting how these boundaries are far from fixed. The third example is a PhD dissertation written by Helen Jennings on articulations of indigeneity and spirituality in indigenous tourism in British Columbia, Canada. Again, in a definitional sense, Jennings may be considered an outsider who studied practices of a distant community, but who takes the work of tourism seriously. Her work contains rich ethnography and reflects on outsider and insider engagement with tourism using decolonizing methodologies and the notion of guesthood as a way to enter the field and analyze the material. In effect, the researcher presents the stories of 6 interlocutors in their own voice. The analysis points to overarching tropes that connected these voices. The fourth example is my own PhD dissertation that explores Naganess, indigeneity, and religion as articulated in a newspaper called the Morung Express, and by its founders and journalists. My work is an example of the in-betweens, outsider to some categories of research, but insider to some others. I will lay these out in some more detail later. But before doing so, it must be noted that common aspects of these studies are not only about insider and outsider deliberations, but their usage of comparative methods that these studies employ to lesser or more degrees. They examine how indigeneity and religion are articulated, translated, or performed. Specifically, these studies may be understood through the notion of interested or placed comparison. Scholar of religious studies, Hugh Urban, has described interested or placed comparison as comparative work in and through which we admit, articulate, and defend our own positions in the world, while at the same time subjecting them to reflection, criticism, and the possibility of change. This must be done in the process of comparing incongruous events, discourses, practices, or things, or indeed while studying or comparing acts of comparisons among people and communities in the world, or a comparison of comparisons. Let me now explore how the notion of interested comparison may be used in understanding my own work. My PhD research was conducted between 2019 and 2023 in Nagaland, that lies between India, Myanmar, China, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, and is marked with a black circle here. It examined how a newspaper called the Morung Express, with a strong interest in indigenous and Christian issues, articulated shared and contested notions related to their identity as Nagas. Consequently, Naganess, indigeneity, and religion became focus areas of study in the newspaper and through its workers. Among the 4 concepts that I studied, I relate as an outsider to Naganess, to indigeneity, and religion. This is to say that I am not a member of any collective that associates with these categories. But I am a member of the 4th and most important pillar of the study, which is the news media. In Nagaland, that in some way or the other is connected to the other 3 notions. What does it mean for me to have worked with the news media I studied? That is the newspaper called the Morung Express. Does not a journalistic association end when the contract between my employer and me as an employee ends? Yet, a former association with the newspaper brought a host of methodological benefits and some challenges to my study. So, what kind of vantage points did I gain as an academic from having practiced as a journalist with the Morung Express? The first step in this regard is to state that there is always a process involved in being an outsider or being recognized or identified as an outsider who has a view from elsewhere, from their class, caste, age, gender, race, or other vantage points, to a shift in their place to stand as more information and better understanding ensues. I assume that this opening up results in a shift in the place where the outsider observer once stood towards a process of insiding, which can obviously never be complete in a full-bodied sense. The outsider researcher may become a friend, a confidant, a guest, or perhaps even have no other status than a researcher. In my case, this process ensued from the time I began working with the Morung Express. It was the institution's focus and stress on inclusive politics that enabled a process that incited me, to whatever degree, into the newspaper's language, style, mode, and paradigm of journalism. This is a cycle that I suggest repeats as individuals participate in diverse structures that they may not always have been part of or identified with. I will point to a few vantage points I gained as a result of this insided view while conducting my PhD research. First, having worked with the institution from 2011 to 19, I had a closer understanding of news cycles at this news institution that other scholars may not have had, but only as much as my journalistic colleagues also would have had. In research terms, this helped me develop a disciplined thematic comparison that helped compare different events and issues through notions like calendars and prohibitions. I was studying only 1 year of the newspaper, and this narrow cross-section still enabled me to say something general in terms of articulations that the newspaper has made over the years. Second, over the years, I had developed a network that was way beyond the professional realms of journalism. Many people became my friends and family, developing trust and comradeship with each other. Reading about Nagas as suggesting mystified essential cores to their human being made me deeply uncomfortable, having known the diverse networks, ideologies, mechanisms, institutions, and classes that informed who Nagas are in the world. If indigeneity and religion were to be put to test, the essentializing notion of Naganess seemed to me the connecting and grounding point of this investigation. Not because Naganess is effervescent, but just the opposite. It is something specific and relational. What makes Naganess so important in the world today? What politics are stressed when people use it as a part of their struggles, large or small? What are the myriad structures that operate in Nagaland today? Which ones could we read about in the public arena of the newspaper? My dissertation was thus eventually titled The Morung Express, Naganess, Indigeneity and Religion. Third, I was a journalist over and above anything else before stepping into academia. It was the primary practice through which my colleagues and I collaborated at the Morung Express. When I went back to the newsroom to conduct interviews with them in the capacity of an academic in 2022, it was my responsibility to establish this boundary. For the 4 months that I conducted interviews with the journalists, editors, and founders of the newspaper between 22 and 23, I worked from a desk at the headquarters of the Morung Express in Dimapur. This was only a practical measure, given the lack of libraries and other public workspaces in the city. Scholars before me had used the offices of the Morung Express as a workspace, and I asked the newspaper's publisher if I could do the same. As a pedagogical site for collective learning, the Morung Express agreed to have its editorial office opened up to academic outsiders, a space into which most newspaper offices would never allow entrance to the Prime Minister, leave alone research scholars. To establish my presence, in any case, as a former employee, I was slightly different from other scholars. To establish my presence in the office as an academic outsider this time, I put up information sheets about my study in every room of the newspaper's office in Dimapur, with their permission, of course, and often worked during the morning hours and kept away from evening editorial meetings. Being journalists, of course, my former colleagues understood these boundaries really well. However, despite the presence of these ruffling A4-sized information sheets, I felt an insider to the blue walls and white tube lights of the Dimapur office of the Morung Express. I was in that newsroom in February 2023 when the elections to the Nagaland Legislative Assembly was conducted. It was one of the biggest challenges I faced, to stay away from reportage and maintain my objective presence as only an academic. The fourth involves the power vantage point that I held working as an Indian journalist and now academic in Nagaland and on Naga issues. The history of political relations between the Nagas and between the Naga and Indian polities has been marked by the unjust and unacknowledged use of force. Indian armed forces, as representatives of the government of India and Nagaland for many decades, have militarized and torn up Naga lives and society with complete impunity. The power imbalance these actions built has crept into almost every institutional, social, and sometimes individual relations between the Nagas and India. This power imbalance came up often as I reported the news in Nagaland, but also enabled me to be as critical as I wanted to be. This, while Naga journalists still find it difficult to enter and work as equals in Indian newsrooms. Even in Nagaland itself, to date, there are few institutions that build professional journalists, except on-site training through the newsroom. Safety for journalists is an unheard of concept, and the profession has never become financially stable for those who want to participate in this democratic endeavor in Nagaland. In this sea of uncertainty, my secure caste and class Indianness gave me many degrees of certainty, as also a few gender-based challenges. How these power imbalances have implicitly informed my research is something that my former journalist colleagues and others can point out best. The entire process, of course, repeated in rather different ways when I joined the university system in 2019. Entering the academic circle as an outsider with a view from elsewhere involved burying myself in books, articles, lectures, discussions on ways to shift the place to stand and conduct research from. Through this inciting process, though this inciting process ensued over a shorter time span, the academic access to time, space, and resources that the UIT afforded me led to several different gains. I will mention only two here. First, academic learning at UIT and through other research training courses taught me to think about indigeneity and religion in complex and challenging new ways. How may we think of these as categories in use by different actors in the world? Through what registers, scales, or cognates? Who is involved in generating, articulating, translating, performing, and comparing them in different ways? For what purposes? If these things are not once and for all decided norms, what makes these concepts shift and how? Starting from these points, challenged many of the taken for granted notions I had brought along with me from Nagaland when I first got here. Second, I was trained in theory and methods that form the jumping board of academic investigations. Grappling with articulation theory, for instance, that became a companion theory to converse with my empirical data, I went down several black holes of theory. I shuttled wildly between modernist structuralist thinking to postmodern post-structuralist ideas in trying to find where theories come from, what approaches they bring, etc. Further, endless discussions with my supervisors, PhD colleagues, and sifting through the data opened up comparison as a method that I applied in systematizing a large body of data drawn from newspaper content and semi-structured interviews. A location within the university gave me the method of reverse fieldwork. This means I wrote out and analyzed the textual data before I conducted fieldwork. How did my critically distant analysis, through imposing the categories of research on my material, impact my conversations with my former colleagues who wrote and edited the news under analysis? Interesting new directions opened up that resulted in the addition of a new section to my research work. Pursuing these directions was possible through my location within the university, connecting and interacting with scholars at other universities, and the networks facilitated by this organism called the academy I had seldom worked with closely before. So what advantage did all of this bring to the analysis of the material I identified in the Morrow Express? I was able to conceptualize what kind of a public sphere the Morrow Express may be. That is context, and some of the historical and contemporary conditions it inhabits and reproduces, that is process. First, I proposed the newspaper's published works to enable the formation of knowledge as commons. Second, I proposed that the Morrow Express, as any other media institution, inhabits an articulated media paradigm which may be read in the context of the newspaper as a Morong media paradigm. These are dense ideas I will not torment you with at this moment. What is important to note here is that I would not have dared push my analysis in these directions, leave alone put these in a dissertation in 2011, when the Morong Express and I began our collaboration. I would not have formulated these in 2019 when I began my research work at UIT. Let us then, for a moment, step back to what we had considered while starting off from Robert Merton and Audre Lorde. Individuals have not a single status, but a status set. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. How do we understand the processes through which we step into one status set or the other or two? How do we engage with multiple struggles? To grapple with this, I proposed a process that applied to understand my entry and practice into journalism and academia. Through this, we may perceive one way in which we as researchers, particularly who are not born into our profession, go from being particularized outsiders that hold a view from elsewhere to a shift in the place we stand. This may lead to degrees of insiding as the process repeats in multiple directions. We thus remain partial outsiders and insiders to various categories that include our professional practice as academics or journalists or both, among others. However, it is important to remember here who has access to processes like these. The scholar and activist Sumit Samos and others have repeatedly pointed out how a Brahmin scholar can step right into a Dalit home and society to study it. But this access is not permitted to the Dalit scholar to step into a Brahmin home to study its practices of untouchability and bordering. Traveling in the Naga Hills in the 1930s, the Austria-born anthropologist Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf made a great many friends with the Nagas he met. His anthropology was facilitated by the British colonial mission to the region at the time. While thinking of the processes I have proposed here, it is important to remember that while Heimendorf was able to choose his Naga friendships, it was impossible for a Naga person at the time to land up in an Austrian neighborhood to choose a friend like Heimendorf or study his society or write a book hypothetically titled The Not-So-Naked Austrians. This is in reference to Heimendorf's famous book titled The Naked Nagas, which was published in 1939. This model is thus most applicable to those of us who still hold the privilege of outsider and insided positions all at once. Our analysis must keep a firm eye on historical and material contingencies that enable our approaches to, relations in, and with the world we inhabit and engage. This process that I highlighted, helped me draw up a more specific list of points from which I conducted my PhD research from at least two status sets or professions I partially inhabit. Claiming an interested comparison in my case involved conducting research from two insides, one as a former journalist of the Morong Express and the other a current academic at UIT's Department of Archaeology, History, Religious Studies, and Theology. My interest in developing large and small comparisons as part of my PhD research was facilitated through a view and training as both a journalist and an academic. As a former journalist, the shared trust with my former colleagues in the newsroom opened up the space for academic inquiry. As an academic, I gained some distance from them by doing a content analysis of what the journalists produced as a first step to designing interviews with them. As a former journalist, I could identify some of the recurring issues in a small and focused cross-section of the newspaper, but that say something in general about the newspaper's coverage. As an academic, I learned the art of comparisons, or of a comparative model, to identify how umbrella categories could be used to study commonalities and differences in seemingly incongruous practices, discourses, or things. Additionally, what did it mean for my research partners, such as the Morung Express, to involve in acts of comparisons as they build their journalism? As a journalist, I constantly wish to report the daily news rather than study it from a safe distance. As an academic, I constantly reverted to dense concepts and analysis, struggling to keep it historical and relational, not unmoored and in a vacuum of banal objectivity. I became both an academic and journalist in place and with a partial view to examine the research questions I had set out to answer. I hope this lecture has helped you understand how we may address questions about conducting research from multiple starting points. Thank you for listening.
The committee will now evaluate the lecture, and if they find it satisfactory, the candidate will have the opportunity to defend her thesis in a public presentation tomorrow at 15 o'clock. The presentation will take place in this auditorium. Thank you, everyone, for taking part in this event today, and I hope to see you all here again tomorrow.